the circular economy can play a crucial role as an active mechanism for combating climate change. One of the most evident examples of this insensitive development model which wastes resources, energy, and multiplies waste, a problem that requires a commitment at global level, as we heard at the Paris summit, but it also requires local actions as well. To talk to us about the circular economy and the fight against climate change and how this then is transferred to urban areas, we'd like to invite Teresa Ribera Rodriguez, who's the director of the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, the IDDRI of Paris. She was previously an advisor on climate policy between 2008 and 2012. She was also Secretary of State for Climate Change, and she participates very actively with experts in this field in different international institutions, in NGOs, and also in the social media, where we often see that she's very active. Teresa, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Jose Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And as we saw yesterday, when we checked the microphones, the lighting, everything, we've seen that everything has worked perfectly. I'd like to thank the FEMP, the FAMP, and also the City of Seville, and also Ecoembes for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this event today in relation to a subject which is probably the subject. And it makes me quite anxious having to talk about something which touches upon climate, circular economy, cities before all of you, because you're all experts in these different realities in your respective fields. And particularly in a context in which one of the most surprising elements has been the important presence of mayors and mayoresses. Their presence has been very important because until recently they weren't known as being charismatic stakeholders outside of areas in which they would normally perform their functions. Mayors, mayoresses have always served as benchmarks, references for citizens in any city or town. And they're the people who 24 hours a day knew who was going to be available to resolve any problem at any time. It was like a myth ever since with the mayor of Salamea, or just, these famous mayors from history. But that charisma is currently in its golden age, and it extends beyond its natural geographical space, urban areas, or the areas in which their functions are limited at municipal level. Anne Hidalgo is now in New York. She's developing an important initiative, Women for Climate, within the concept of the C40, which is one of the major cities networks. And all of these activities are announced also as if they were accompanied by an Olympic medal. We all know the names of the mayors of the most important cities in the world. We all listen very carefully and watch what they do and don't do. And we all know what's been described over the last 20 or 30 years regarding thinking locally, acting globally, and all of this is perhaps a case of think locally, act globally. Today, that phrase is something that we often don't embrace in urban areas, which is where the largest population is going to be concentrated in the future. Therefore, the way in which the problems of these urban areas are resolved extends beyond the local. And this is something that is a reality. It's true. We understand this to be the case, and hence a change of approach is required. But the charisma that breaks these molds and which can be transformed into global charisma among leaders and society in relation to economic and environmental actions, I think that its roots can be found in the traditions of municipal policy. And sometimes we've lost track of these. They perhaps deceived us, but they can coincide with the priorities and needs that exist today. People, institutions, and governments that are accustomed to thinking systemically. They're not sectorial representatives that only resolve things within their line of action independently of what others do. They have to provide a comprehensive response to a whole series of challenges that are clearly interrelated and for which partial responses are insufficient. And they've often been subject to tension, dialogue, conversation and participation, to a much more intense process of comparison, together with all of those that make this a reality. So perhaps at other administrative levels, I've never held any local administrative post or function myself, but from other administrative levels, perhaps this has been lost and forgotten. It's important to talk, understand, respond, and cater for the needs and concerns of everyone, and think beyond one's own agenda. But inertia, daily problems, and difficulties have caused us to relax, given the important role that the local level has to play. And after simply having praised the role of local government, why it's currently living a type of golden age, and regardless of whether they like it or not, they're going to be at the heart of the storm for years to come. But we've also observed that something else has changed in recent years. And this is perhaps related to this notion of circular economy, because it's not just the economy that's circular. At the beginning, somebody said that nature is wise and we should learn how to mimic nature. But circular economy is much broader. We're no longer living in linear spaces where somebody takes a decision, somebody implements it, and somebody then evaluates it. There's a huge level of interdependence. We all need each other. We cannot work on the basis of competition against one, or having limited, restricted agendas which are completely different to those of others. And it's not a case of mayors fighting other mayors, or one sectorial policy versus another, or a mayor against the government, or a citizen against the mayor, or a company against municipal government. Each of us in our respective areas has a direct impact on the degree of success or risk of failure of everyone else in society. And this forces us to change our mindset and to act in a completely different way. It forces us to be much more practical in something which comes out of Louise's words this morning. There are more and more people on our planet every day, but we have to use the same resources. And evidently, if we all aspire to a certain level of prosperity, we should all reflect on the part of the equation that allows for a certain degree of flexibility. In other words, governance. How can we guarantee that prosperity for everyone within the chemical and physical boundaries of our planet and its limitations? We either reach a minimum of consensus on how we can do this, otherwise we are destined to conflict and failure. The second message, well, this is an inevitable agenda. It has a very strong degree of interdependence. And in this agenda, intelligence in relation to governments, procurement and participation is critical. It is an agenda in which the core role of cities and towns allows us to identify solutions and project realities that are perceived much earlier and much more quickly. So what we have to do is to, let's say, to drive that process, and also we have to address these difficulties in a process of change that nobody's managed to complete, because we're talking about a transformation and it's very difficult to see how that can happen overnight. So to the extent that it's inevitable, we have to manage this intelligently, embrace change and see exactly how we can do this, because I'm sure that there will be a way in which we can find a way of achieving this objective. But in reality, the way in which this is done, as I said before, well, there's no answer. Nobody has the answer. And I think I wouldn't even dare to try to propose any solution myself. But I think together we can find solutions. We can identify the reasons and elements which can allow us to promote that change. In English, you'd say, be water, my friend. So we have to find things that we can change and change them. This is critical. this will facilitate what comes afterwards. Globally, it could be thought, or we could think, let's say, of different scenarios in which this could be reproduced. For example, we could think of the huge challenge that the circular economy, sustainability and climate represents for advanced industrialized societies, maybe the societies that we belong to, where the population is going to grow only slightly. The populations in our countries will age, and most of our resources and infrastructures are in place. It's more a question of reinventing those spaces to make it ready for the 21st centuries, to release resources to guarantee the prosperities of those of us living within these physical limits on our planet. It's not the same, for example, in the case of emerging countries that have huge populations that are emerging from poverty, that are growing at a rapid pace. It's difficult for them to grow in a smart manner, bearing in mind that there is a tendency for exponential growth, which can undermine and prejudice many of these variables if we don't monitor them. But this can apply very much as well to middle-income countries which have already emerged from poverty, overcome problems of poverty, and where urban transformation processes are currently at the stage in which they have to decide what growth model, what services and what tax systems will support it, what options will allow them to serve. Again, well, I'm not trying to do any publicity, but everyone will understand what I'm trying to say. Do you want to be a city like Barcelona, or do you want to be a city like Atlanta? To what extent would you combine that proposal of public services, that integration, or a society that's more individual and dispersed, with a much more intense consumption level? And this is one of the big challenges facing middle-sized cities, which has got nothing to do with the situation in the poorest countries, the most vulnerable countries, where needs are much more basic, rudimentary. But essentially the response that is provided will have an immediate impact which goes beyond their borders. It's important to be supportive, but at the same time, selfishly, we should accompany a process of urban growth that is sufficiently reasonable and sensible to avoid risks of collapse. But returning to Europe, our situation here is that our cities are largely consolidated. We don't envisage strong growth in the coming years, but we will face tremendous challenges when it comes to the reinvention of those urban areas in relation to consumption, reinvention in order to avoid these concentrations of poverty, exclusion, etc., in contrast to this inclusive model that people have tried to build over many decades. And we have to think about specific formulae which, through the renovation of systems and infrastructures, will allow these prosperous societies to be maintained in the coming decades. And once again, I have to say that each person has to, or each city has to find its levers for change. But I'd like to mention some that I'm sure you're very familiar with, but these are just ideas that can help us to shed light on some of these issues. Juan Espadas, in his introductory words, referred to recovered urban spaces, recovered uses or new uses of land, which can allow these cities to permeate in a different way. For many years, people have obviously taken into account the positive and negative aspects of urban development, but once again today, there's this need to develop and build buildings that are closer to zero energy consumption, but also spaces that can be used much more at times in which there may be a reconstruction and reconsideration of certain spaces as mines that can be used to excavate minerals, which can then be reintegrated in the production cycle, and this is critical. The great line of consumption of resources, a wide variety of resources. I mentioned land before, but we could also talk about water and energy. Waste management's another matter that's been mentioned this morning. Food and food waste. Well, the challenges are enormous. We're talking about a huge number of aspects which are of concern in urban areas. And a few days ago, I read something that really surprised me. In Andalusia in general, I expect that the situation is critical in this respect. It was a heading in a paper that stated roads being washed with drinking water, welcome to the modern world. This beautiful resource, water, which has to be reread and rethought precisely in relation to its definition. So we can find cities that are in a better position, that are in a worse position in terms of their water supply systems, their water supply networks, and the necessary quality of water, and also taking into account invisible and forecastable demand in the coming years. Water and energy as critical factors in this whole process of climate change, and also the impacts of climate change, which are giving rise to changes in hydrometeorological changes, which can give rise to situations of tremendous drought and vulnerability due to floods. Rising temperatures or sudden increases in temperatures can give rise to important changes in the demand of these resources, which should cause us to, or prompt us to, reflect on the most intelligent model for guaranteeing supply, for guaranteeing our resilience before this changing climate. Energy, which at the end of the day will include four main variables on which cities' actions will differ. The cities' actions will differ in relation to energy depending on whether they have a greater or lesser role to play, but in certain areas cities can play a very leading role. Energy in relation to electricity production based on new models, on new technological and technical models which will allow us to combine large generation plants with microgeneration plants and also help us to reduce consumers' energy bills. Transport, which together with housing account for 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. National transport, which in Europe represents 48% of emissions and 31% of emissions in Spain. Domestic transport, which is not just urban transport, it also includes interurban transport, but it allows us to think about the type of mobility models and what type of offer of mobility services can be developed in urban areas. Housing, well, as I said before, this represents or is accompanied by emissions which are approximately 40–45% on average in the European Union. In Spain, they're below that level at 25%, but it's true that the thermal factor is completely different in our country. However, the relative energy efficiency levels of our buildings are far from optimum. There's a great deal of work that has to be done there. There are many other advantages, however, that we will achieve with this in terms of quality of life, reduction of poverty, and also energy consumption, but in other areas is extremely complex, having said that. And I've said this bearing in mind that collaboration between the different levels is going to be crucial in decision-making. Luis Planas referred to some of the critical aspects of the package of energy proposals that were presented by the European Commission. And it's evident that the European Union has made enormous efforts. You may consider them to be good, bad, inefficient, but it has made enormous efforts in this respect, highlighting different aspects. For example, in transport, it focused on vehicle standards or fuel standards. I won't go into detail, of course, and I don't want to make any comments more about what's going to happen with those standards, which may be rather controversial, but they have also worked a little on the regulations applicable to those. There's a whole arsenal of measures that have been introduced which go beyond this initial vision, which is often the case in community regulations, and also different forecasts regarding certain energy or sectorial proposals or energy proposals. We need to reach a sufficient level of understanding and consensus between those who take fiscal or tax-related decisions, those who take decisions in relation to expenditure and industry or infrastructures, innovation or social well-being, and those who are entrusted with taking decisions on public procurement. and decision makers on how we have to reconcile and collaborate between the different levels of responsibility of the different public administrations. It's also important to understand that the tools available are very different, but they must be more and more coherent. Yesterday evening, we mentioned that one of the great limitations, this was actually the first comment that was made by the president of the region of Emilia-Romagna. He said that it's all very well and good to make slogans and declarations and come up with priorities, but it's much harder to go back home and to actually put into practice those priorities. And it's all very well and good that at national level or at local level, these are the priorities, but then the financial and fiscal impacts are not in line with those priorities. And the facility to find the instruments and elements which will allow us to promote and facilitate this change, well, if the rehabilitation of a given or reform of a given neighborhood will require so much money and will also generate so much employment. So if we were to ask a private bank, could we repay that loan within a given period? Well, private banking or private banks don't understand how this type of loan can be granted, but the response on the part of public authorities is still insufficient. What we should do, perhaps, is list the level of responsibility of each institution and come up with an agenda which is compatible to ensure that each participant can contribute in the necessary level. So in relation to what I said before, be water, my friend, there's still a lot of work to be done. Compatible responses will be required, coherent responses between the different levels of administration, but it's true that in each of our respective realities, there is still a long way to go. Paris has undertaken to be neutral in emissions and even in imports, whether it's in relation to everyday consumer appliances, but also in relation to many other aspects by the year 2050. We'll have to see whether it achieves this. But Paris is making an effort to see how it can try to achieve that objective. But there are many other spaces and signs of a much more short-term nature which will yield immediate results, with respect to which the European Commission is inviting proposals. And perhaps we can explore possibilities and see exactly how we can make relevant contributions at GDP level, at the level of public procurement. I don't have any more time, but I would like to conclude by just making one comment about Europe's agenda and the climate agenda. For me, this city has a very special meaning in this respect, and it always has done. But somebody reminded me yesterday, somebody who's not in the room today, just by chance, by fate, because these are things you cannot predict, I had to preside a formal commission of ministers in Seville here in 2010. And I say that this was by chance because nobody could have imagined that in 2010 the Lisbon Treaty had just come into force, and the role of each community institution was not very clear, because nobody could imagine that 1 month before Copenhagen was going to be affected so much by climate change and a multilateral system, and nobody could have imagined that for personal reasons, unfortunately, the Spanish minister that would have presided that meeting was unable to participate in that Council of Ministers, so I had to take a place. And it was a very interesting Council of Ministers meeting, and it was very interesting because it was a time at which Europe was extremely hurt. Europe felt that it had led this process of fighting climate change for many years, and it had been humiliated at the Copenhagen summit. And it was a moment of reflection. It's important to remember that at that time the Council of Ministers of Environment of the European Union, Ed Miliband was the Labour Party leader, Paul Madet was also there. So there was a degree of political commitment that was very important, and also a very Europeist vocation and a very important global vocation as well. But a great deal of frustration in relation to that multilateral process, which was not moving forward. At Copenhagen, the discussions were complex, and there was a great temptation to state that the multilateral system doesn't give us what we need, so let's go outside the multilateral system. Thank God we didn't. We reached the conclusion that we have to support the multilateral system, that we have to guarantee Europe's identity signs and characteristics, and that the conversion of our development model and our economic model into something which is solvent, with people at the center, is critical for progress, for peace, and for security and safety of our populations in the decades to come. And this was perhaps the greatest contribution of that Council of Ministers meeting, which, as I said, took place in Seville. Seville embraced that commitment. It was the physical space where that commitment was embraced to multilateral action, to Europeanism, to support, to combat climate change and to support sustainability. And we're in another critical period now with different stakeholders, but it's a sensitive and delicate time. Last week it was the 25th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty. Next week it will be the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. Today we're celebrating elections in Holland, the results can be tremendous. In a few weeks there will be elections in France and then in Germany. We have Juncker's white paper that was presented by the President of the Commission, which offers very different scenarios, asking questions such as what do we want to be. I think it's not just enough to ensure that, or for there to be the voice of the governments or intellectuals. I think that cities, mayors, and municipal governments and administrations should vindicate that leading role, which they can do and vindicate today. And with a strong voice, you have to say that you want to work in this united Europe, in this construction process, which is going to be based on a circular economy, on progress and sustainability. And it's much easier if we work in accordance with the rules and values that unite us, rather than doing it independently. At the end of the day, that is the context, that is the framework that municipal government representatives have dedicated their lives to for many years. Renovating the agenda into something which is also accompanied by challenges, but which should fill us with enthusiasm. There are many questions to be answered, and they can be answered positively or negatively. And I believe that in this room, everyone is extremely committed to ensuring that we come up with the right answers. Thank you.